The heavy rain fell hard against the windshield of the broken-down vehicle, blurring the desolate Texas highway into a chaotic wash of gray and black. It was the winter of 1979, and the storm was a relentless force of nature, swallowing the asphalt in a sea of freezing mud and roaring thunder. Inside that stranded, shivering tour bus, a young and entirely unknown country singer watched the deluge, his dreams seemingly stalled forever in the unforgiving sludge. His engine had died miles away from the nearest town, the heater was broken, and hope was fading with the dying light of the afternoon. Then, through the torrential downpour, a pair of dim yellow headlights pierced the darkness. A humble mechanic and rancher named Tom stepped out of his beat-up truck and into the freezing rain, his heavy leather boots sinking deep into the mud. He did not ask who was on the bus. He did not ask if they had money. Tom simply opened the hood, his hands already scarred by decades of hard work and honest labor, and fought the freezing metal and sparking wires until the engine roared back to life. When the young singer, shivering and endlessly grateful, tried to empty his thin wallet to pay for the rescue, Tom just smiled, wiped the grease from his brow, and shook the young man's hand. He refused every single dollar. Tom looked the young man in the eye and told him that gentlemen do not charge to help a man keep moving down his path, and he asked only that the young man keep the music playing. Tom walked back into the storm, a silent guardian of the highway, leaving behind a debt of honor that the young singer would carry in his heart for the rest of his life. Decades later, the freezing rain of that memory has long evaporated, replaced by the blistering, merciless Sunday morning sun of the Texas Hill Country. It is Mother's Day, a day meant for celebration, family gatherings, and gratitude, but the air surrounding the century-old farmhouse is thick with the scent of baked dust, dry lavender, and an unbearable, suffocating sorrow. The relentless humming of the cicadas sounds like a funeral dirge across the sprawling acres of dry grass. Martha Hayes, 70 years old and entirely alone in the world, stands on the creaking wooden porch of the home where she built her entire life. Her hands, fragile and trembling, are tightly clasped around a single worn cardboard box. Inside this box are not valuables of gold or silver, but the true treasures of a life well lived. Faded photo albums, handwritten recipes, and a single Polaroid picture of her late husband Tom standing proudly next to a broken-down tour bus in the rain. The house behind her is a hollow shell. The walls, once covered in memories, are now bare, exposing the faded patches of wallpaper where picture frames used to hang. The scent of old pine wood and the sweet aroma of the peach cobbler she used to bake have been replaced by the sterile, invasive smell of cardboard and packing tape. The silence of the empty rooms is broken only by the heavy, rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the hallway, a family heirloom that is about to be confiscated and sold to the highest bidder. Martha's eyes, clouded with unshed tears and the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights, stare out at the front lawn. The reality of her nightmare is unfolding right before her. Parked on the dying grass, crushing the wildflower she had planted with Tom, is the local sheriff's cruiser. Its red and blue lights flash in a silent, agonizing rhythm, casting harsh colors against the white wooden pillars of the porch. Sheriff Miller, a man who has eaten at Martha's dining table and prayed in her living room, stands by the cruiser with his head bowed, his face flushed with a deep, humiliating shame. He cannot bring himself to look the elderly widow in the eye. Surrounding the cruiser are the heavy, rumbling trucks of a commercial moving company. Men with thick gloves and indifferent expressions march up and down the steps, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards like the marching of an invading army. They carry out the rustic oak dining table where Martha and Tom shared 40 years of suppers. They carry out the rocking chair where Martha sat through countless summer evenings. Every piece of furniture crossing the threshold feels like a physical blow to Martha's chest, tearing away the very fabric of her existence. Martha is drowning in a sea of medical debts, a crushing mountain of bills left behind after Tom's long, agonizing, and ultimately fatal battle with illness. She gave every penny they had saved, mortgaged the land they loved, and sold off the cattle just to buy a few more months with the man who was her entire world. When Tom finally closed his eyes for the last time, Martha was left with a broken heart and a stack of papers that she could barely understand. The system, cold and unforgiving, did not care about her grief. It did not care about the decades of honest taxes paid, the community service, or the undeniable goodness of the Hayes family. The system only saw numbers on a spreadsheet, and Martha's numbers were in the red. 200 miles away, in the sterile, air-conditioned glass towers of Austin, Texas, the tragedy of Martha Hayes is nothing more than a stepping stone for a man named Richard Vance. Vance is a junior executive at a massive predatory investment bank. He's a man who wears custom-tailored Italian suits, drinks imported coffee, and views the sprawling historic ranches of the Texas Hill Country as nothing more than dirt waiting to be paved over. Vance has a predatory smirk and a heart as cold as the marble floors of his corporate lobby. He is exactly 1 quarter away from a massive promotion, and to secure his new corner office, He has been aggressively accelerating foreclosure processes on undervalued rural properties. He wants the land. He has a vision of bulldozing the historic farms to build a sprawling, soulless luxury resort for wealthy investors. Martha's farmhouse, sitting on prime acreage with a natural spring, is his crown jewel. When Martha first received the letters of default, she did what any honest, hard-working woman would do. She put on her best Sunday dress, the one with the modest floral print, polished her only pair of good shoes, and took a 3-hour bus ride to the city of Austin. She walked into the towering glass cathedral of the investment bank, feeling smaller and more vulnerable than she ever had in her life. She waited for 4 hours in a waiting room that felt like a freezer, ignored by passing executives who looked at her as if she were a ghost from a forgotten era. When she was finally allowed into Richard Vance's immaculate office, she tried to explain her situation. She brought her meticulous ledger, showing that she could make partial payments. She spoke of Tom, of the land, of the history buried in the soil. Richard Vance did not even look up from his computer screen for the first 5 minutes. When he finally did, he leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his manicured fingers, and treated Martha with a cruelty so casual it took her breath away. He mocked her emotional attachment to the dirt. He smiled a thin, venomous smile and told her that people from the past have absolutely no place in the future of Texas. He told her that her husband's medical bills were not the bank's problem, and that sentimentality does not pay the interest. Martha begged for just a little more time, just enough to sell a portion of the land herself so she could keep the house. Vance leaned forward, his eyes devoid of any human empathy, and informed her that the eviction notice had already been expedited. He purposefully scheduled the execution of the foreclosure for Sunday Mother's Day. He knew exactly what he was doing. By scheduling it on a Sunday, he guaranteed that all county offices and courthouses would be closed. Martha would have absolutely no way to file a last-minute injunction. She would be trapped, voiceless, and utterly defenseless. The cruelty of that meeting broke something inside Martha. She rode the bus back to the hill country in complete silence, watching the rolling hills blur through her tears. Over the next week, the tension in the farmhouse escalated into pure desperation. Martha swallowed her pride and called distant relatives, but times were hard for everyone, and no one had the kind of money the bank was demanding. She tried to apply for emergency lines of credit, but her age and debt-to-income ratio caused automated systems to reject her applications within seconds. The bureaucracy of the modern world was a towering, impenetrable wall of concrete against which her lifetime of memories was being violently smashed to pieces. She spent her nights walking through the empty rooms, touching the walls, praying for a miracle that she felt she did not deserve, apologizing to the empty air for failing to protect the home Tom had worked so hard to maintain. Now, on this suffocatingly hot Sunday morning, the absolute lowest point of her life has arrived. The heat is already radiating from the dry earth, baking the air and making it hard to breathe. The moving men are ruthlessly efficient, stripping the house of its soul piece by piece. Sheriff Miller finally steps away from his cruiser, his boots crunching on the gravel. He walks up the porch steps, taking off his hat and clutching it to his chest. His voice cracks as he mumbles a string of desperate apologies. He tells Martha that he is so sorry that he wishes he could do something, anything, but his hands are tied by the judge's orders and the relentless machinery of the law. Martha just nods slowly, her face pale and drawn. She does not blame the sheriff. She knows he's just a man doing a job he hates. Then, a sleek, black luxury SUV turns off the main highway and begins to kick up a massive cloud of white dust as it speeds down Martha's long driveway. The vehicle is entirely out of place in the rustic setting, a gleaming symbol of corporate arrogance invading the sacred quiet of the country. The SUV comes to an aggressive halt right in the middle of Martha's front garden, its heavy tires crushing a bed of carefully tended bluebonnets. The driver's door opens, and Richard Vance steps out into the Texas heat. He's wearing a crisp polo shirt and designer sunglasses, looking more like a man arriving at a country club than a man coming to destroy a widow's life. He wants to oversee the eviction personally. He wants to ensure that the property is completely vacant and secured before his wealthy investors arrive for a tour on Monday morning. Vance surveys the scene with a look of supreme satisfaction. He watches the moving men carry out Martha's life, and a smug, victorious smile spreads across his face. He checks his expensive gold watch, clearly impatient, and begins to walk toward the porch. He does not wipe his shoes. He steps onto the wooden planks with an air of absolute ownership, looking down at Martha, as if she were an insect that had overstayed its welcome. He extends his hand not to offer comfort, but to demand the final surrender. He asks for the keys to the property, his voice dripping with condescension, telling her that the truck is waiting to take her and her remaining box to whatever state-funded facility will take her in. Martha feels the weight of the world pressing down on her frail shoulders. She clutches the photograph of Tom against her chest, her heart shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The humiliation is total, absolute, and suffocating. The heritage of an entire lifetime, the blood, sweat, and tears of a good man, all reduced to a corporate trophy for a greedy executive. Slowly, agonizingly, Martha reaches into the pocket of her faded dress. Her hand is trembling so violently she can barely hold the brass keys. The keys that unlocked the door to her sanctuary. The keys that Tom had placed in her hand on the day they were married. She raises her shaking hand, extending it toward Richard Vance's waiting, manicured palm. Vance's smile widens into a grin of pure, unadulterated triumph. Right at this moment of absolute despair, where injustice seems to have won and the keys are about to fall into the hands of a cruel man, you might wonder if hope still exists in this world. If you believe that divine and Texan justice never sleeps, subscribe to this channel right now to discover how the tide is about to turn. The brass keys were worn smooth by decades of use, the jagged edges softened by the countless times Tom had turned the lock after a long, grueling day working the pastures. Martha could feel the residual warmth of her own trembling palm radiating through the cold metal. To anyone else, it was just a piece of brass on a faded woven keychain. To Martha, it was the physical manifestation of her entire existence. It was the sound of the front door opening on a rainy Tuesday. It was the security of a roof over their heads during the terrifying tornado warnings of the late 80s. It was the sanctuary where she had nursed Tom through his final agonizing days. And now she was being forced to surrender it to a man who saw absolutely no value in anything that could not be deposited into a bank account. Richard Vance adjusted his designer sunglasses, the mirrored lenses reflecting Martha's broken, fragile posture. He let out an exaggerated theatrical sigh, pulling back his tailored sleeve to check his heavy gold watch for the third time in 2 minutes. He shifted his weight from one expensive Italian leather loafer to the other, making a quiet sound of irritation with his tongue. He looked at the elderly widow, not with an ounce of pity, but with the profound annoyance of a man swatting away a mosquito. He leaned in closer, invading her space, the smell of his expensive, overpowering cologne mixing sickeningly with the dry dust of the porch. He told her in a low, mocking whisper that she was making this much harder than it needed to be. He told her that holding onto the keys for another 10 seconds would not bring her husband back from the grave, nor would it magically produce the hundreds of thousands of dollars she owed his institution. He smiled that thin, venomous smile, extending his manicured hand just a fraction of an inch closer, waiting for the inevitable drop of the metal into his palm. Martha closed her eyes. A single scalding tear broke free from her lashes, cutting a clean path through the fine layer of dust on her wrinkled cheek. She silently asked Tom for forgiveness. She told him, in the quiet sanctuary of her own mind, that she had fought as hard as she could, but the world had grown too cold, too fast, and too cruel for an old woman to fight alone. Her fingers, stiff with arthritis and heavy with defeat, began to uncurl. The keys slipped down, the metal sliding against her skin, gravity preparing to claim the final victory for the corporate machine. Before the brass could break contact with her skin, before the keys could drop into the waiting, greedy hand of Richard Vance, a sound tore through the suffocating silence of the Sunday morning. It was not the rumble of another moving truck. It was not the distant wail of a siren. It was a low, guttural, powerful roar of heavy engines echoing across the limestone valley. The sound was so commanding, so deeply resonant, that the cicadas instantly stopped their relentless humming. Vance froze, his hand still suspended in the air. He turned his head, a frown of deep irritation wrinkling his perfectly moisturized forehead. Sheriff Miller, who had been staring at the ground in silent shame, immediately snapped his head up, instinctively resting his hand on his heavy leather utility belt. Even the moving men, who were halfway down the porch steps, carrying Martha's antique floral sofa, stopped dead in their tracks, their muscles straining under the weight as they looked toward the long, winding dirt road that led to the property. A massive cloud of golden Texas dust was rising on the horizon, billowing into the clear blue sky like smoke from a cannon. Cutting through the dust, moving with a terrifying, undeniable velocity, were 2 vehicles. They were not lost tourists looking for directions. They moved with a synchronized, predatory purpose. Leading the charge was a massive, pristine black Lincoln Continental. Its chrome grille caught the harsh morning sun, flashing like a blade. The tinted windows were pitch black, revealing absolutely nothing of the occupants inside. Following tightly behind the Lincoln was a heavy-duty Ford F-150, painted in a deep midnight blue that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was not a show truck. It was a machine built for power, yet it was kept in immaculate condition, moving with the quiet confidence of a sleeping giant. The vehicles did not slow down to admire the scenery. They tore up the gravel driveway, the tires crushing the limestone rocks with an aggressive, rhythmic crunch that sounded like bones snapping. Vance took a step back, instinctively pulling his hand away from Martha, his corporate bravado momentarily pierced by the sheer physical intimidation of the approaching convoy. The vehicles slammed on their brakes just inches away from Vance's illegally parked luxury SUV. The heavy tires kicked up a final, massive wave of white dust that washed over the lawn, coating Vance's expensive Italian loafers and making him cough violently, waving his hands in front of his face in a panic. The dust began to settle, suspended in the thick, hot air like a golden mist. For 5 agonizingly long seconds, nobody moved. The engines of the Lincoln and the Ford idled with a low, menacing purr. Then, the heavy, reinforced door of the Lincoln Continental opened with a solid, metallic thud that echoed across the yard. A man stepped out into the Texas heat, and the atmosphere on the porch instantly plummeted by 10 degrees. It was Arthur Sterling. He was a man who moved with the terrifying, effortless grace of an apex predator. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair swept back perfectly, wearing a dark, 3-piece pinstripe suit that looked entirely out of place in the rural landscape. Yet somehow, he made the landscape look out of place around him. The blistering heat of the sun seemed to actively avoid him. He did not sweat. He did not squint. In his right hand, he carried a vintage ox-blood leather briefcase that radiated an aura of immense, untouchable wealth and devastating legal power. Sterling did not look at the house. He did not look at the moving men. He did not even look at Richard Vance, who was currently furiously brushing the dust off his polo shirt. Sterling's sharp, predatory gaze locked instantly onto Sheriff Miller. With slow, deliberate steps, Sterling walked up the wooden stairs of the porch. Every time his polished leather shoes struck the wooden planks, it sounded like a gavel striking a judge's block, delivering a final, inescapable verdict. Vance, recovering from his initial shock and feeling his authority slipping away in front of his subordinates, puffed out his chest and stepped directly into Sterling's path. He raised his chin, adopting his most aggressive boardroom posture, demanding to know who this man was and who gave him the right to trespass on private property during an active bank-ordered foreclosure. Vance's voice was loud, shrill, and completely lacking the gravity he thought it possessed. Sterling stopped. He slowly turned his head to look at Vance. The look in Sterling's eyes was not anger. It was something much worse. It was the look a scientist gives a particularly annoying insect right before dropping it into a jar of formaldehyde. Sterling did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he spoke, his voice was smooth, cold, and sharp enough to cut through solid steel. He informed Vance that he was speaking to Arthur Sterling, senior partner and lead counsel for Strait'S Enterprises, and that if Vance did not step aside in the next 3 seconds, he would personally ensure that Vance would spend the rest of his miserable, insignificant career defending himself against federal harassment lawsuits that would bankrupt his entire bloodline. Vance swallowed hard, the color rapidly draining from his face. The name of the firm hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. Even in the insulated, arrogant world of Austin investment banking, the legal division of Strait'S Enterprises was legendary. They were known for being ruthless, brilliant, and backed by a reservoir of capital that made Vance's bank look like a children's lemonade stand. Vance took a clumsy step backward, his bravado crumbling into a pathetic, nervous stutter. Sterling ignored the broken executive and turned his attention back to Sheriff Miller. He opened his oxblood briefcase with a sharp click. He pulled out a thick stack of documents, heavily stamped with federal seals and the undeniable blue ink of a United States district judge. He handed the papers to the sheriff, his tone shifting from venomous to deeply respectful. He informed the sheriff that the eviction order he was currently executing was entirely null and void, and that any further removal of property from the premises would be considered criminal theft and prosecuted to the absolute maximum extent of the law. Sheriff Miller took the papers, his hands slightly shaking. He adjusted his glasses, reading over the first page. A massive, genuine smile slowly broke across his weathered face. The heavy burden of guilt that had been crushing his chest all morning instantly evaporated. He looked up at the moving men, who were still holding the floral sofa, and barked an order, telling them to put the furniture back exactly where they found it, warning them not to scratch the hardwood floors on their way in. Vance, watching his entire $250,000 promotion evaporate before his eyes, lost whatever small amount of composure he had left. He pushed past the sheriff. His voice cracking with panic and rage, he pointed a trembling finger at Sterling, screaming that this was impossible. He yelled that his bank held the deed, that his bank owned the debt, and that no judge in the state of Texas could magically erase a legally binding foreclosure on a Sunday morning. He demanded to know what kind of fraudulent paperwork Sterling was trying to pass off. Sterling slowly closed his briefcase. He turned back to Vance, a terrifying razor-sharp smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked Vance up and down, taking in the expensive watch, the designer sunglasses, the pathetic desperation of a man who suddenly realized he was out of his depth. Sterling spoke slowly, enunciating every single word so that the absolute devastation of his message would land with maximum impact. He explained to Vance that he was entirely correct. A judge cannot erase a debt, but a judge can oversee the transfer of one. Sterling informed the junior executive that over the course of the last 48 hours, his client had initiated and successfully executed a hostile, aggressive, and complete buyout of the entire regional loan portfolio managed by Vance's specific branch. Sterling took a step closer, his height and presence forcing Vance to cower backward against the porch railing. Sterling whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the dead silence of the yard, that Vance's bank no longer owned Martha Hayes' house. In fact, as of midnight last night, Sterling's client owned the paper on the house, the land it sat on, and a controlling interest in the very branch that signed Vance's paychecks. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind seemed to stop blowing. The reality of the situation crashed down upon Richard Vance with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. A thick bead of sweat rolled down his temple, stinging his eye, but he was too paralyzed by fear to wipe it away. His mind raced, desperately trying to comprehend the sheer, astronomical scale of the financial violence that had just been committed against his institution. To buy out an entire regional portfolio in a single weekend required a level of liquid capital and influence that was almost mythical. It was a maneuver of pure, unadulterated power. Vance's knees literally buckled, his hand gripping the wooden railing to keep from collapsing onto the porch. He looked at Sterling, his eyes wide with a terror he had never known. He stammered, his voice reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. He asked the only question his broken mind could formulate. He asked who in the world had the power, the money, and the sheer, terrifying will to do something like this. He asked why a billionaire would spend millions of dollars just to save one worthless, broken-down farm owned by a useless old widow. Arthur Sterling did not answer. His terrifying smile simply widened, and he took a step to the side, clearing the view to the driveway. Down on the dusty grass, the heavy, dark blue door of the Ford F-150 opened with a solid, resonant click. The sound was not loud, but in the dead silence of the Texas morning, it echoed like a gunshot. A pair of worn, brown leather boots stepped out of the truck and onto the dry, cracked earth. They were not the boots of a man who worked in a glass tower. They were the boots of a man who knew the smell of rain on the dirt, a man who knew the value of a hard day's labor, a man who had walked millions of miles across stages and pastures alike. The dust settled around the leather as the man stood up to his full height. He wore a pair of starched, dark blue jeans that fell perfectly over the boots. A simple silver belt buckle caught the morning sun, reflecting a blinding beam of light across the yard. He wore a crisp, light-colored button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the forearms, revealing the strong, capable hands of a man who had never forgotten where he came from. And resting perfectly on his head, casting a deep, protective shadow over his eyes, was the iconic, immaculate shape of a resistal cowboy hat. He closed the truck door behind him. He did not slam it. He moved with a calm, stoic, and devastatingly powerful grace. He began to walk toward the porch. Every step he took seemed to alter the very gravity of the space around him. The air grew thick with an unspoken, legendary authority. The moving men dropped their heads in immediate, instinctive reverence. Sheriff Miller stood at absolute attention, his chest puffed out, tears of profound respect welling in his eyes. Martha Hayes, still clutching the brass keys in her trembling hand, let out a soft, breathless gasp. Her knees felt weak, not from fear, but from the overwhelming, radiating warmth of a presence she thought she would never see again. She looked at the man walking toward her, recognizing the broad shoulders, the steady gait, and the quiet dignity that defined the very soul of the American West. The man who had just dismantled a corporate empire before breakfast. The man who never forgot a debt of honor. The silence on the porch was absolute, a heavy, reverent stillness that seemed to freeze time itself. The man walking up the wooden steps did not possess the aggressive, predatory energy of Arthur Sterling, nor did he carry the pathetic, frantic desperation of Richard Vance. He moved with the quiet, immovable certainty of a mountain. The wooden planks, which had groaned under the heavy boots of the moving men, seemed to accept his steps with a familiar, welcoming silence. As he reached the top of the stairs, he reached up with a calloused, steady hand and slowly removed his resistal hat, holding it respectfully against his chest. The harsh Texas sun illuminated his face, the calm, weathered features, the eyes that had seen a million miles of highway, and the gentle, knowing smile that had comforted generations. It was George Strait. He completely ignored Richard Vance. He did not even look in the direction of the trembling executive, treating him with the absolute invisibility that a man of true substance reserves for those who possess none. Instead, George's eyes locked onto Martha. He saw the trembling in her hands, the tear stains cutting through the dust on her cheeks, and the way she desperately clutched the faded Polaroid photograph of her late husband. The sight of her vulnerability, of the profound injustice that had almost been inflicted upon her, caused a brief, almost imperceptible hardening in his jaw. The quiet, dangerous anger of a true Texas gentleman witnessing the mistreatment of a lady. George took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. He looked down at the brass keys still resting in her shaking palm. With a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the immense power he had just wielded to destroy a financial institution, he reached out and gently closed her fingers back over the keys. His hand, warm and steady, enveloped hers, stopping the trembling completely. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," George said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, carrying the smooth, unmistakable Texas drawl that had echoed through arenas around the world. Yet here, on this dusty porch, it sounded like a quiet prayer. I apologize for the intrusion on a Sunday morning, and I apologize for the dust my trucks kicked up on your bluebonnets. Tom always did take pride in that garden. Martha stared up at him, her breath caught in her throat. The years fell away, and for a fleeting second, she was not a broken widow facing eviction. She was a young woman standing next to her strong, capable husband in the freezing rain of 1979, watching a young, shivering singer shake Tom's grease-stained hand. "You remember," she whispered, her voice cracking, a tear finally spilling over and dropping onto George's hand. "After all these years, all the fame, all the miles, you remember my Tom." George smiled, a genuine, heartbreakingly tender expression. "Ma'am, a man doesn't forget the hand that pulls him out of the mud when the whole world is passing him by. Your husband pulled my bus out of a ditch near Amarillo in the winter of '79. I was cold, I was broke, and I was about ready to quit. Tom spent 3 hours in the freezing rain fixing my engine. When I tried to give him the last $20 I had to my name, he looked me dead in the eye and told me that gentlemen do not charge to help a man keep moving down his path." George paused, his eyes gleaming with a profound, unspoken respect. "He asked me to just keep the music playing. I made him a promise that day. And a promise made in the rain is a debt that doesn't wash away with time." George turned slightly, his gaze finally shifting to Richard Vance. The temperature on the porch seemed to drop instantly. The gentle warmth in George's eyes vanished, replaced by the cold, hard stare of a man who had zero tolerance for cruelty. Vance, who had been trying to shrink into the background, suddenly found himself pinned under the weight of a legendary gaze. He tried to speak, tried to formulate an apology, but his throat was completely dry. "Mr. Vance," George said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a lethal, quiet authority that required no volume to be terrifying. "The way you conduct your business is a disgrace to the state of Texas. You look at this land and you see dirt. You look at this woman and you see a number on a spreadsheet. You forgot that the dirt you want to pave over was bought with the blood and sweat of good men like Tom Hayes, men who built this country while men like you sat in air-conditioned rooms trying to figure out how to steal it from them." Vance swallowed hard, his face pale, his expensive sunglasses trembling in his hand. "Mr. Straight, sir, I was just following bank protocol. It's just business. I didn't know she was a friend of yours. If I had known, I would have..." "You would have what?" George interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "You would have treated her with the basic human dignity she deserves? You only respect power, Mr. Vance. You only respect money. Well, now you're looking at both." George took a step closer to the executive, towering over him, the embodiment of the stoic cowboy delivering a final, inescapable judgment. "As Mr. Sterling informed you, my company now owns your portfolio, which means I own your bank's debt, which means, as of this morning, you work for me." Vance's eyes widened in sheer panic. He nodded frantically, a pathetic, desperate attempt to save his career. "Yes, sir." "Absolutely, sir. Whatever you need, Mr. Straight. We can restructure the loan, we can..." "No, we can't," George said softly, shaking his head. "Because your first official act as my employee was to try and evict a widow on Mother's Day. And your second official act..." George paused, the silence stretching out, heavy and absolute. "Is your immediate resignation. You're fired, Mr. Vance. Clear out your desk by tomorrow morning. And if I ever hear that you're working in the loan department of any bank within the borders of this state, Mr. Sterling will make sure you spend the rest of your life tied up in litigation so thick you won't be able to afford the gas to drive out of Austin." George did not wait for a response. He turned his back on the broken executive, dismissing him utterly and completely. He looked over at Sheriff Miller, who was standing tall, a massive grin on his face. "Sheriff," George said, touching the brim of his hat, "I believe this gentleman is trespassing on private property. Would you mind escorting him off Mrs. Hayes' lawn?" "It would be my absolute pleasure, Mr. Straight," the sheriff replied, his hand resting comfortably on his belt as he took a step toward Vance. "All right, son, you heard the man. Get in your fancy car and get off this property before I decide to arrest you for destruction of a bluebonnet bed." Vance did not say a word. He practically ran down the stairs, tripping over his own expensive loafers, completely humiliated and stripped of all his corporate armor. He scrambled into his luxury SUV, the tires spinning wildly in the dirt as he reversed out of the yard, fleeing the scene like a beaten dog, leaving behind nothing but a cloud of dust that was quickly blown away by the morning breeze. George turned back to Martha. He gestured to Arthur Sterling, who stepped forward and opened his oxblood briefcase. Sterling pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and handed it to George. George took the envelope and gently placed it into Martha's trembling hands. "Mrs. Hayes," George said softly, "inside that envelope is the deed to this farm. It is fully paid off, free and clear, in your name. There are no more mortgages. There are no more bank loans. This land belongs to you, and it will belong to your family for as long as you see fit." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a smaller sealed envelope, placing it on top of the deed. "And this is a cashier's check that will cover the entirety of Tom's medical bills, with enough left over to fix that roof and hire some hands to help you maintain the property." Martha stared at the envelopes, the weight of the paper feeling heavier than gold. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face uncontrollably. "George, I can't accept this. It's too much. Tom just fixed a radiator. He wouldn't want me taking charity." George smiled, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Martha, this isn't charity. This is a return on an investment. Tom invested his time, his sweat, and his kindness into a young kid who had nothing. He kept the music playing. This is just me paying my tab." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a gentle whisper. "Please, ma'am, let me do this. Let me honor the man who saved my dream." Martha looked into his eyes, seeing the absolute sincerity, the unwavering honor of a man who had conquered the world but never lost his soul. She finally nodded, pulling the envelopes to her chest, sobbing quietly into the crisp paper. George wrapped his arms around her, holding the fragile widow in a strong, protective embrace, letting her cry out the months of terror, grief, and exhaustion. Down on the lawn, the moving men, who had been watching the entire exchange in stunned silence, suddenly sprang into action. Without being asked, without a single word of complaint, they began rushing up and down the stairs, carrying the furniture back inside. They moved with a joyful, frantic energy, carefully placing the antique floral sofa back in the living room, setting up the oak dining table, and gently returning the grandfather clock to its rightful place in the hallway. They didn't charge a single cent for the return trip. The narrative shifts, the harsh, unforgiving sun of that Sunday morning dissolving into the golden amber light of a late summer afternoon. The Texas hill country is alive with the sound of cicadas, but now the sound is no longer a funeral dirge. It is a peaceful, rhythmic heartbeat. The century-old farmhouse stands proud, its white paint fresh and gleaming, the roof fully repaired, and the front garden bursting with a vibrant, meticulously tended sea of bluebonnets. Martha Hayes sits in her rocking chair on the porch wearing a bright floral dress, her face relaxed, the heavy lines of stress and sorrow replaced by a quiet, enduring peace. She holds a tall glass of iced tea, the condensation dripping down the sides. Sitting right next to her, with his worn leather boots propped up comfortably on the wooden railing, is George Strait. He holds a glass of tea in his hand, his resistal hat resting on his knee, looking out over the rolling hills as the sun begins to set, casting long, beautiful shadows across the pasture. They aren't talking about record sales or sold-out stadiums or the ruthless world of corporate banking. They are talking about horses. They are laughing about the time Tom tried to fix a tractor with nothing but duct tape and a prayer. They are simply two people, bound together by a memory in the rain, sharing the quiet, sacred peace of a Texas evening. The wind blows through the lavender, carrying the scent of the dry earth and the undeniable truth that in a world obsessed with money and power, there is still nothing stronger, nothing more absolute than the silent, unbreakable honor of a good man.